Please be seated. It is a treat to welcome Ray Suarez back to Chicago and to our convention. Ray is a prominent broadcast journalist, critically acclaimed author, and lifelong Episcopalian. And for the past year has been the visiting professor of American Studies at Amherst College. You may well remember Ray from his time with the Al Jazeera America Network, or as senior correspondent on the PBS NewsHour, and as host of the national public radio program Talk of the Nation. In his more than 30-year career in the news business, he has also worked as a reporter in London and Rome, as well as Chicago and in Los Angeles, and as a CNN correspondent. Ray joins us today to talk about who is going to be in the pews in 2040. Ray Suarez, welcome. Yes, sir.
Well, it's nice to be back in Chicago. Up until a few minutes ago, I was wearing jeans, sneakers, and a sweatshirt from a college I did not attend. And I hustled in here because you know when you get off a plane at O'Hare that's an hour and 50 minutes late for an hour and 40-minute flight, that you're going to have an interesting day. Your day has already begun in an interesting way. And though I didn't want to take a walk down memory lane, getting on the choked Bessie Coleman Drive and then getting on the tollway and then getting on 88, and they're all under construction, made me yearn for my old home in Logan Square. Thanks to Bishop Lee for bringing me back home. I was a member of the Cathedral congregation for many years. I'm sure there's a couple of people here from the Cathedral, right? See, you don't give them a fancy table up front, I see. It's all right. My son was baptized there. I served on the board of Episcopal Charities for many years, and in that capacity, visited our supported ministries every year because I was on the committee that gave out the money. I knew in abstract all along, but saw as a visitor in reality what hardworking, faithful, loving people can do for others, how the powerful, explosive, catalytic combination of a little money and a lot of hard work can demonstrate in real time, not in the world's economy, but in God's economy, the abundant, effusive generosity that's supercharged by love, by compassion, by remembering that we are members of what our presiding bishop calls the Jesus movement. And to be one of those is not just a be thing, but a do thing. It's not a t-shirt, it's not a lapel pin, it's not a placard you wear around your neck. It is not just an identity, it's a do thing. And I hear from, I've been on college campus for much of the last year and a half, and I often hear my kids talk about, I identify as this, I identify as that. It's a very, very big verb right now, identify. This is not just an identity, it's a way of life. And yet, we are living through tough times. And more tough times are on tap in the years ahead as we figure out how to be the church, how to follow the example of the Master in a country where we no longer can depend on, where we no longer can be sure of, a certain ambient cultural deference toward Christianity that prevailed through most of American history. I mean, Thanksgiving's coming. You're going to see a lot of pictures of pilgrims on their knees in the next couple of weeks. Even the most casual observer of the trends of American religion has seen the numbers. Even the most optimistic among us about the future of the church has to concede that writ large as an American institution, capital T, capital C, the church, it no longer speaks with the authority or the convening power that it once did. At the beginning of this year, during winter break, I was fortunate enough to be in London. My wife and I took a quick tube ride to St. Paul's Cathedral for choral evensong. The setting, the lectionary, evening prayer, and the magnificent choir were, as you might expect, stunningly beautiful, transporting, able to reach you in ways that few other things can. Choir and the clergy party process out of the choir stalls of the great cathedral. The small group gathered there for evensong process out onto the drizzly, chilly, dark London streets. And in my Anglican reverie, turn to my wife, smile, and say, you know, it's times like this when I think, thank God for making me an Episcopalian. She is more, let's say, reverie averse than I am, and she sort of yanked on the reins and said, well, God didn't make you an Episcopalian, your parents did. All right, fair enough. But as I thought about what to say to you all today, about who will be in the pews in 2040 and beyond, it occurs to me that both parents and God are not busily making enough Episcopalians for us to confidently and serenely look ahead at the next 25 years and be secure about what happens to the parish churches of this diocese and hundreds and hundreds of places across the country. I wish I could tell you the news was better. There are, of course, always bright spots, places where spirit-filled volunteers and inspired parish leaders, lay and ordained, are doing great things. However, reported in sorrow, reported in alarm, and sometimes with people who are just generally hostile toward religion in general, reported with great glee, each year brings new research, new surveys, new databases from groups like Pew or the Public Religion Research Institute, PRRI, that agree on a few big things. One, among all American adults, let's say from 18 to 90, a larger percentage every year have no religious affiliation. And that's up drastically just from 2000. Whether raised with a religion in the family home and abandoning it as adults, or in fact never professing a faith identity, whether leaving abruptly after a last straw moment or simply drifting away, a new, drastically higher percentage of people are what demographers and social scientists are calling nones, N-O-N-E-S, people with no religious affiliation. In just a handful of years, from 2007 to 2014, according to Pew, the percentage of unaffiliated adults rose from 16 to 23%. That's just in 7 years. There are, as you might expect, regional variations. Some parts of the country are more affiliated than others, some drastically less. There are now 20 states in the Union in which no religious group comprises a greater share of congregationally affiliated adults than the nones do. The nones are the largest single faith group in the state, or unfaith group in the state, I guess you'd call them. These 20 are heavily concentrated in the West and New England. 40% of Vermonters have no religious affiliation. Oregon, Washington, Colorado, New Hampshire are among the states where Sunday morning can be more generally devoted to dog walking or the newspaper, for people who still do that, or a tea time. Second, as much as the trend is gaining strength across many age groups, it's most pronounced among under 30s, people who will be in their 50s in the 2040s and 50s. a majority of people born in the last decades of the 20th century say they attend religious services a few times a year at most. 36% of younger millennials, more than a third of those born in the 90s, are unaffiliated. In fact, among millennials, the unaffiliated are now the single largest faith orientation, outnumbering Catholics and Protestants. In every metric of religious practice used by opinion researchers, prayer, reading scripture, attendance, giving money, saying religion is important in their lives, people born in the 80s and 90s are not just a little different from their older relatives, but significantly so. The rewrite of American immigration laws in 1965 swung the axes of American origins away from a 2-century-long emphasis on Europe and toward the rest of the world. In 1950, just one of the 10 largest birth countries of foreign-born Americans sent largely non-white immigrants to the United States. One out of the top 10 countries. By 2010, 9 out of the top 10 countries of origin of foreign-born Americans send mostly or solely non-white immigrants to the United States. These post-65 changes literally saved the Roman Catholic Church in America from institutional failure, from a kind of collapse, fueled the growth of Islam in America from a relatively tiny group of a few 100,000 people in 1960 to several millions today. Here in Illinois, across the Sun Belt, in the giant metros of the West Coast and Northeast, Sikh gurdwaras, Buddhist and Hindu temples have taken their places in community skylines along with the more familiar soaring steeples topped by a cross. So in 2018, what's the assignment? What are we supposed to do with that information and the daunting set of numbers that come with it? I want you to consider today this possibility, that if inheritance and heritage and family origins mean less today in making individual American religious choices, does that paradoxically mean that we have more of a shot with different people than we would have had in 1950, when most of the people in the pews were there, well, because their parents made them Episcopalians, like mine did? Do we have a shot at convincing a far wider audience than we once did what community and commitment, a life of joy, looks like, that gives us a chance with people who 30 or 40 years ago never would have given us a second thought? Yes, we know we can't rely on the people we once relied on, but we can also appeal to a wider group of Americans than we could before. The largest single share of American adults, 30 to glory, are people who have changed their faith affiliation at one point in their adult lives. The plurality of American adults have, for want of a better term, converted from one thing to another. That is a huge number in comparison with earlier decades. Does that offer us an opportunity that we didn't have before? Before we even set out to do, I don't know, something, do we also have to admit to ourselves how conflicted we are about evangelism? Is there a reluctance to tell other people or even convince ourselves what we have to offer? If we were to set out a more entrepreneurial path over the 82 years to 2100, are we just climbing into the muck with toothpaste and detergent and canned soup if we allow ourselves to think about this thing of ours that we think is good for us, good for the world, makes life saner, makes life better, more coherent, heals the wounds of a suffering world? Thinking of it like a product, is that a bad thing? Is it the thing we have to do now? If we call it a product, even quietly sotto voce to ourselves, are we being honest with ourselves, or are we just conforming to the ways of the world? I have to ask because I suspect that if I went individually around this big room, I'd get a lot of different answers to those very questions about how comfortable we are with the idea that we have a product, one that unfortunately is in competition with many similar products. In this specific, peculiar case, it's a product of centuries of wondering and arguing and praying and reading and studying and arguing some more, and then getting on boats and planes to bring those ideas and the arguments and the propositions we make about the shape of the world to other people. How ready are we to do that in a world where we're not even sure we're going to get a hearing? A world where our crowd might have once had the power to command, the authority to demand a certain amount of deference, a certain amount of obedience, and now we can only use a softer kind of power. Among the so-called mainline churches, we are having a particularly bad half-century. And there's a paradox embedded in that as well. Author James Twitchell points out in his bracing, entertaining, and occasionally infuriating book, Shopping for God, young people have terrible associations with the word, just the word Christian. Now, the mainline churches might answer, hey, we're not like that. Turns out that's not, in and of itself, sufficient. Now, the churches that it might be argued contribute most robustly to those negative public impressions are declining too. But they're not declining as fast as the Presbyterian Church, the United Methodists, the United Church of Christ, the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, the Disciples of Christ, the American Baptists, or us. And for me, here's where things get confusing. The news is full of the highly politicized parts of the wider church because of the ferocious reaction to marriage equality, the cruel slanders against gay people, the antiquated ideas about gender and worship, the unforgiving harshness of the public posture of some of those churches. Okay, again, you might respond, well, we don't do that. Yet we're shrinking faster than the churches that do. In Unchristian, What a New Generation Really Thinks About Christianity by David Kinnaman, the Barna Group looked at polling among 16 to 29-year-olds and found three main attributes that people that age associate, say back to you when you say to them the word Christian. Number one, at 91%, anti-gay. Number two, at 87%, judgmental. And number three, at 85%, hypocritical. I don't think a marketing company would have a lot of joy for you if you went in with those numbers and said, okay, let's do some brand expansion here. 7 of the top 10 words given in response to the word Christian by 16 to 29-year-olds are negative. Yet I keep reading about the dissatisfaction with big box retail religion, arena-sized churches, feel-good preaching, and happy-clappy skimming of the challenge of the Christian life. We, in this branch of the church, demand a rigorous path to ordination, scholarship, training in preaching, Our prayer book has for centuries been one of the glories of the English language. We've wrestled, sometimes too publicly, with the challenge of defining what's eternal and unchanging, and what demands in our current time to be rethought. And those arguments have been painful and have split church families and families. Broken dioceses, nasty institutional divorces, decamping congregations, endless lawsuits about property. There are, as the last 30 years have demonstrated, few easy rewards that come from just being us, just doing what the canons say do, just continuing on with what we've been doing. When I look out at my classes, I see young people, smart, engaged, curious about the world, utterly unaware and uninterested in the difference between an Episcopalian and a Methodist. It's all irrelevant to them. Their experience is not our experience, and they don't think they're missing a thing. They don't think they're missing anything. In a class I taught last spring, one of my students included this passage in an essay. Quote, "To me, someone who thinks there could be a higher power but isn't interested in finding a place of worship that feels good, someone who's still very much that 5-year-old who'd get bored and whine during church, someone that a church may target their ads at, it simply doesn't seem effective. You might be able to convince me that I need a new smartphone, or super healthy water, or that GMO-free salmon, but how are you going to convince me that I need your brand of religion? Your religion is judgment-free? Cool. Your church is fancy and comfortable? Cool. Your pastor is fun and charismatic? Cool. I don't really care. Unless you can offer something amazing, like weekly meetings with Jesus himself, there's nothing you can say that will make me or any other potential customers want to come to your service every week. So who are you actually selling to?" He's a smart kid, this writer, a freshman. Later in the assignment, he concluded, religion with a big R, that is, religion as an institution, from an outsider's perspective, looks to be doomed. Yikes. So again, what's the assignment? What is history and the demand of the present age insisting we do now? On one level, you're already doing it. You're here. You're keeping the candles lit, not these particular candles, which I had requested in advance. You're keeping the candles lit, the buildings heated, the doors open, and continuing to welcome all who want to be part of this thing. That's at least the beginning of a plausible answer for a place of worship vying for attention in a broad marketplace no longer defined by custom and family history and such. But we have to admit to ourselves we are not, again, the world's greatest evangelists. We, as a church, did not run west to chase the moving frontier, as many other American churches did. And we don't get an 1830 do-over. We didn't go. That's why the further east you go, dioceses are smaller and tightly packed, and the further west you go, they're whole states with a couple of dozen congregations. Simply continuing to do what we do and do it really well is not alone going to be enough. So what's the imperative? Is it to hold on fast to what we've got, solidify and stabilize before stepping out into a less receptive culture to preach and teach? The country's changing and changing drastically in racial and ethnic terms and in religious terms, as I've mentioned. That's an opportunity, not a threat. To be relevant in 2040 and beyond, the Episcopal Church can't look the way it did in 1880 and 1920. But the good news is it already doesn't. We're doing that. We are. Look at our leaders, look at our congregations, look at you. There is an inverse relationship, and I'm going back to the challenges now. Enough of the good news, back to the challenges. There is an inverse relationship, broadly speaking, between church affiliation and education, meaning the more educated you are, the less likely you are to be congregationally affiliated. And of course, I say that broadly speaking because every Sunday morning in America sees very lightly educated people sleeping in and exquisitely educated people heading into a pew somewhere, so obviously at the margins there are exceptions. But broadly speaking, the more education you have, the less likely you are to be congregationally affiliated. And where does that leave us? Episcopalians are among a handful of small American religious groups: Jews, Hindus, Unitarians, and us. That's the top four. Jews, Hindus, Unitarians, and us. You might call us the small four. Top of the league table for average years of schooling. So we don't have that going for us. There is also an inverse relationship between family size and education. So we're in great shape. Well-educated, good earners don't have so many kids, generally speaking, which means that when it's Sunday school time, there's not a lot of waste inventory. We've got to keep everybody in the boat. We put a huge emphasis on getting our own kids exquisitely educated, which on average is going to mean they marry people of similar educational level. So we pay forward our demographic challenges and make them intergenerational. They are going to marry people who are similarly educated, similarly unaffiliated in large measure, and give you very few grandchildren at the same time. So they are more likely to spend Sunday morning with bagels in the Sunday Times than with the 1982 hymnal. In the eye-opening journey among America's nuns, written by religion professor Elizabeth Drescher, Choosing My Religion, nice pun on the REM song, but Choosing My Religion, terrific book. This scholar of American religion noticed something interesting. A lot of young adults raised in the church are out, but they're not hostile to religious practice, to religious faith, to religious teaching. Many told her they value what they were taught as youngsters. Over time, though, they just drifted out the door, and nobody stopped them. My daughter is an Episcopal priest working in Manhattan. The 20s and 30s ministry at her church is a busy, lively congregation within a congregation. A lot of the members are new to town, brought to New York by work or school, and looking for connections and community, and finding it by either coming in from another branch of the church or returning to the church home of their childhood, and now, increasingly, without having to get married or have children to do those things. That was our old calculus, right? Oh, don't worry, they'll be back when they get married. Well, now that's happening at 30 instead of 23, and once you've been out the door for 10 years, staying out the door gets a lot easier. The age at first marriage has been rising over the last half-century. It's been rising as our church has been shrinking. I told my son when he left for college that I would never order him to go to church, that I would never even ask him to go to church after bringing him there myself for his whole life until he departed for college. It's not just institutions that have less authority, fathers have less authority too. I pointed out that by moving to a new place, in this case, Hyde Park, to attend the University of Chicago. And living among thousands of strangers is hard. But if he wanted to find people he knew or felt like he always knew, the place to go was Brent House, the Episcopal chaplaincy at the University of Chicago. Oh, they're here too, okay. That chaplaincy would offer instant community if he was feeling lonely. It worked. He was active all 4 years. He was eventually the student leader of the center in his senior year. And years later, he is not definitely sure there's a God, but he still goes to church. Because what is taught there reaches him, touches him, challenges him, and he still wants that in his life. And a church with a praise band or a pastor in Dockers, and I'm willing to stipulate that many of the clergy I see sitting here look just fine in Dockers. Not our thing, not how we do things, that's good. But a church has to have a reason to continue to exist, and we have to be really clear about what ours is. When I was the keynote speaker a few years ago at the Diocesan Convention of the Diocese of Massachusetts, one rector came up to me after my talk and told me, "Don't worry so much. As long as Roman Catholics keep marrying Methodists, we're going to be okay." In 2018, it's not going to be enough. It's just not going to be enough. The largest single self-description among the nuns, especially the young ones, is spiritual but not religious. Whenever a young person says that to me, I keep a poker face because I'm like that. And I wonder, what the heck do you mean by that? But how exactly should we reach a 25-year-old who went to church, not necessarily ours, new to town, coming back to a community after leaving for college? Just keep on being us and just hope they find us? Make intentional outreach to young people trying to craft something that answers that need they feel, but doesn't feel too churchy? Is there a way of offering radical welcome, saying we don't care so much about your ecclesiastical resume, whether you sat through catechism class, went to vacation Bible school, or if your parents had you baptized? At least at the beginning, come as you are. Come as who you are. We can work with you, whatever shape you're in when you hit the front door. Seeker, sinner, fellow traveler. Is it a strength that our barriers to entry are low? The Bishop of Washington, Mary Ann Budde, has suggested that if the way we do our Episcopal thing operates as a barrier to people connecting with what we say is the essence of who we are, if we're more concerned with bringing people to Jesus, we need to be a little less concerned with the coming fight over prayer book language. If 500 years of wealth of accumulated liturgy and tradition is a balm and a blessing for some and a barrier for others, we have to thread that needle. And when people say that to me, I think, you're making it sound easier than it is. The bishop knows when she says that, I have my doubts. It's hard to stay close to the people who are already with you, already love you, and find a way to be different to people who are trying to find their way to you. We used to have some measure of confidence that a share of those who had either grown up without a church or drifted away in young adulthood would find their way back through the doors through the urging of a more church-affiliated spouse or a couple's conviction that some religion was a good thing to hand on to a child. With the share of unaffiliated adults so much higher, I don't think that confidence is well placed anymore in the 21st century, just by the rigid demands of mathematics. And I say that as a very poor mathematics student. More young couples having their first children will both be unchurched. So without even a point of reference, without even a dim, inherited cultural memory of what it is church is. But here's perhaps a saving grace. In Drescher's Choosing Our Religion, she says a lot of the nuns should really be called sums, because they haven't totally left the whole thing behind. They totally haven't washed it out of their hair and out of themselves. They've fashioned an adult faith from childhood instruction and from things they've taken on board throughout their lives. And where it ends up is as individual as a thumbprint. Catholicism minus church, plus meditation. Jewish customs plus Buddhist practice. Living room hymn sings and secular sing-ins with friends, or a communally prepared and shared dinner in which they feel they touch something sacred. Drescher calls it the 4 F's. Family, friends, food, and Fido, because she was shocked at how many young adults, when she asked them when they feel the transcendent, they answered that it was when they're taking their pets for a walk in a park. Now, there might be an opening to millions of sums, giving us a shot that we don't have with the real nuns. Some of the sums feel like they were pushed out of church as much as left. The church, writ large, has left a lot of wounded people on the battlefield. People who've been really wounded by everything from outright cruelty to simple neglect. People who put their trust in leaders who let them down. The Jesus movement is not just a movement I can happily be a part of with people who are very different from me and in the movement for different reasons. It's a movement that for the 21st century may be full of appeal as this becomes a country where Christianity is countercultural. It's not in the swim of things to be who we are. It's not swimming in warm water and with the current to be who we are. That stuff we'll sort out over the long haul. One of the frequent complaints of young Americans raised as mainline Protestants, part of the explanation for why they're no longer affiliated, was one of the things that I had long since thought of as a great strength, the church year itself. That cyclical procession of celebration and remembrance and teaching and preaching year in and year out is, it turns out, a weakness. Some young people tell the scholars that we read in my classes that they loved and valued what the church taught them about how to live, how to be a decent person, how to treat people around them, but they say at 21 or 22, I'm good, I got it. I don't have to hear it again. Message received. So maybe for all the off-the-charts scholastic achievement of Anglicans in America, we are really a little slow. Because instead of hearing the Great Commission, the Sermon on the Mount, the Exodus, the Psalms, year after year, and saying, okay, I got it, we come back year after year to hear it again. We are a people for whom words are very important. They're so important that even decades after not hearing them, I'll bet many of you can repeat them by heart. Words, for instance, that I heard over and over again, but actually because of my station as a layperson, never said myself. They're in there, locked in there, in the old lizard brain forever. Ye who do truly and earnestly repent you of your sins and are in love and charity with your neighbors and intend to lead a new life following the commandments of God, and on and on and on. Draw near with faith. What was good about hearing those words again and again? Even as a kid, I was being asked to think about what it would mean to be in love and charity with my neighbors. Who were my neighbors? At 10, did I really intend to lead a new life? If I wasn't particularly feeling faithful at that moment, would I draw near with faith anyway? I was 10 years old and for some reason knew what succor, vouchsafe, and unfeignedly meant. And even though I must admit that hasn't done me that much good in most conversations I have, I'm glad I do know what unfeignedly meant. Fighting about words is a luxury we may have to learn to live without as our buildings empty out and our family fights seem very strange to the share of unaffiliated adults who heard them several times growing up and then decided they didn't need to hear them anymore. And while we're looking ahead a quarter century or so to who's in the pews, we should also take a moment to think about who's in the pulpit. The church's own internal state of the clergy report shows retirements outpacing ordinations by 43%. Fewer young ordinations and more older ones, meaning the age distribution is dangerously skewed toward retirement. Overall, ordinations to the priesthood have fallen by 31% in recent decades, and hiding in the data an interesting development. 30% of ordinations overall are to the permanent diaconate. A smaller church is already in the process of turning to the clerical equivalent of the National Guard to shore up the ranks in cassocks. Our vocational, that's sort of sinking in out there. Are vocational deacons a sign of what's to come as the church right-sizes? A Presbyterian publication has called full-time pastors with no outside employment an endangered species. One study found a majority of ordination-bound divinity school graduates had $40,000 in educational debt, even as they headed into congregations less able to employ them full-time, less able to help them pay down the bills accumulated while getting the training for this life. The Protestant denominations that are shrinking have the most rigorous and lengthy processes for becoming ordained clergy. They require extensive education and demand the talents of a scholar, teacher, counselor, general contractor, liturgist, CFO, and CEO. Churches ask for a lot and sometimes don't promise a lot in return. So being entrepreneurial is going to mean a lot of different choices about where the money comes from, where it goes, who pays for what, and what we can afford to do. We're going to have to close some places, merge some, reimagine some, rebuild others at places that don't look anything like they currently do. The church, but not church places, currently being developed around the country, are trying to meet people where they are instead of standing aloof and waiting till an individual shows up at the door. In Brooklyn, my hometown, St. Lydia's Dinner Church is doing something interesting. On Sunday and Monday evening, the doors are thrown open, people welcomed in, worship conducted around the dinner table. There's prayer, conversation, and music. St. Lydia's is led by ordained people, Lutherans as it happens, who are consciously connecting their practice to that of the early church. But in their pitch to the curious, it's clear they're stepping back from being too programmatic, too creedal, too churchy. They say in part, if you're not sure what you believe, rest assured, neither are we. We place practice before belief, trusting that the practice of eating, praying, and singing together moves us deeper into faith. Instead of trying to figure out what we believe, we're trying to live what we practice. Since I'm not wearing my glasses, I can't tell how many of you shifted in your seats when I said, if you're not sure what you believe, rest assured that neither are we. Challenging words, I think. Are we ready to be a church like that? Do we even want to be? Do we want to be a church that says to people at the front door, don't know what you believe? Neither do we. Or do we have to insist on a few bedrock ideas about why we're not just the club of nice people? I mean, I'm willing to stipulate that most of you could easily join the club of nice people. Not as many as you think. But that's another reason why we're here. But the thing about St. Lydia's that interests me, and I really do have to go there, they are clear in their intent to build down the experience. Make the on-ramp as shallow as possible. Reassure the person considering coming in for dinner that there's not a lot of prior knowledge required. At the same time, trying to be welcoming, informal, and here's what's critical, intimate. Intimacy is one of the things that these potential customers are looking for. Their website instructs, at the dinner table, we invite you to simply engage those around you about normal things. Where are you from? How long have you lived in New York? What were you up to this week? They're all great conversation starters. I got to see that place. For now, St. Lydia's survives on subsidy. There's no way that its front door revenues can pay all its costs. Of course, right here in Chicago, we have the example of Grace Place. Where are my Grace Place people? Oh, yeah? Yeah, okay. You got special seats too, I see. Bottom up, not top down. When my son was recently transferred back to Chicago by his company, he was sort of casting around looking for a place to go, and I suggested Grace Place, and my agnostic Episcopalian son said, oh, I've been there. It's a little too loosey-goosey for me. So it turns out that liturgical conservatism can rear its head in the most unexpected places. But grace is right when it says Christians are not born, they're made. If you'll allow me to end where I began, at St. Paul's Cathedral. Let 1,000 flowers bloom. Let's try these things. Let's try out things that may be even a little uncomfortable for us to figure out what works. We've got a lot to say to a suffering world. We've got to be proud of it. We've got to be proud of what we've got instead of apologizing for it, as, believe me, has become too ingrained a habit in this crowd. Apologizing for who we are and how we got here and all that, that's done. 1534 is done. Just like there's no do-overs on the missions following the frontier west, there's no do-over on Henry VIII's divorce. Done. In the long span of history, we may look back and realize that the best thing that ever happened to us was the removal of social sanction that kept people in the pews, kept them coming week after week because they did not want to be seen not to be there or be marked absent, but they really had no interest in what was going on there. That pressure to conform that kept people coming to church long after they wanted to and long after the hour they first believed. We've got a lot of work to do in the next 20 years. We are going to be here in 2100, and I hope for that diocesan convention you will invite me back. Thank you.
provocateur.
Hold on. I know we're,
So really what this boils down to is Ray has a good chance of being invited back in 2040?
100. Well, 2040.
2100. Me, not so sure. After.
I'll try to make it 2040.
All right, 2040?
We all meet here.
You good with that? So I want to just, yeah, good. Thank you for that. A couple of sentences, and then I'm going to ask you all to do something. Listen, what will your parish be like 10 years from now? Who will be its members? What will be their interests and needs? In what ways will the church, both in your parish and in the diocese, be called upon to serve God in community? That the world is changing is a foregone conclusion. That the church can keep pace with this change is not. That's a quote from the lead article in the diocesan magazine Advance from May of 1961. I just have one response, Ray, other than thanking you, and that's something your student wrote. Like, the only thing that would make church worth my while is if you could do something really awesome, like, you know, have a meeting with Jesus every week. Friends. I believe it's the answer to the conundrum of this belief question, the thing that St. Lydia's is addressing so creatively. The word belief we've turned into, we worship the word belief all too often in church. What we really need to hold up and if you'll forgive me, and worship is relationship. Jesus Christ is present with us in our assemblies, no matter what they look like, what we sing, how we cloak it, what we're wearing, right? And recovering our nerve about that, I think, is the key to everything. And I think your student is absolutely justified in critiquing us because of a Sunday morning in a typical mainline church. It is not at all obvious that that's what we think we're doing. And it can take place at a dinner table as well as at Solemn High Grand Opera. I'm not naming any names. Right? I want to know how you're feeling. And we have a kind of a cool way to take your temperature. I want to ask you to come up with a single word. Be honest. A single word that describes how you're feeling after listening to all of this. And then I want to ask you to help me create a word cloud. If you will look on the screen and you have the capacity to text, I want you to go to www.menti.com and use the code 668844. If you are not equipped with the technology to text, any one person at a table can text 3 times. Find a friend and or a teenager and ask them to text your word. I want to see what shows up. This is in real time. Here's what you're saying.
Unfeignedly thankful makes
Do you know Lee Mitchell, who used to teach liturgy at Sebring? One of the great lines in his liturgy classes was, the prayer book has to change in order to remain the same. A great line. It is. The way Someone explain to me what the word yeet means. Unfeignedly, I understand. Yeet, I don't get. This is interesting. There are a lot of different words. If they're the same words, they get bigger. So y'all like yeet. I don't know. Yeah. Oh. I'm informed by someone's Google search that it's a word used to express excitement. Like squee. Courtesy of the Reverend Lisa Sanuda, Urban Dictionary says yeet is especially used in basketball when someone has shot a three-pointer that they are sure will go into the hoop. This is probably a derivation from the dance, during which the dancer calls out yeet when making a throwing action with their arms. What? All right. I've asked Brother Ray if he'll comment on what he's seeing emerging on the screen.
Well, apart from yeet, which I'm interested in, I'm glad hopeful and challenged is in there because those are not surrender words. Those are good words. Sober is in there, and encouraged is in there, which is great. Encouraged kept getting smaller, I think, as yeet got bigger, but okay. Inspired, thank you. The interesting thing is how many words there are. The interesting thing is that it's not just a half a dozen key phrases that you might find in an SAT question if you had to name the best title for this passage. Cautiously optimistic? You bet. Jazzed? Great. We can work with jazzed. See, and even sobered is fine because this is going to be hard and it's going to involve a lot of difficult choices, and that's fine too.
I see giddy and anger in a corner there. I think that's interesting.
Giddy and anger. As long as it's not the same person, because then you might need help. I think those are fascinating words to use. Disenchanted is in there.
Puzzled.
Obsolescence is in there. And good on you for spelling it correctly. And people are writing unfeignedly and vouchsafe, which is kind of cool. I get it. Okay. The fact that hopeful and challenged are the two biggest words is like giving me a big, wet, sloppy kiss on the cheek, because that's really, I don't want to send you out of here shoulders slumped, looking at the tops of your shoes and thinking, oh, we're just going to fight the rear guard action and save our little pile of chestnuts till we finally have to surrender. No, that's not what I was getting at. So I'm glad challenged and hopeful and yeet are in there. Encouraged is an important word in there, and it's just a little smaller. Young is in there, and if you're feeling young, good. I don't know who you are or whether it's appropriate for you to feel young, but okay. Invigorated, contemplative, esperanza, good. Humored, yes, I've been humoring you, but don't take it the wrong way. Wistful.
Yeah.
Wow. I won't out the person who wrote wistful, but I wasn't going for that at all, actually. But stimulated, good. Puzzled, good.
Need a drink.
Need a drink. Somebody wrote hungry, which, all right. I know you've been sitting a long time. I'm sorry, but we'll get you a snack. Hopeful and challenged got smaller as Yeat got bigger. Okay. I'm going to have to do some more Yeat studies to understand why that is the largest single word in the cloud. Suarez for...
Suarez for president.
Oh, well. You know, we used to have Episcopalian presidents all the time. We're not going to have any anymore.
Thank you.
Thank
Ray.
you.
Thanks, Ray. Just a couple more things. You'll find a yellow card on your table. I hope you'll take those two questions with you to the hearings, in the hallways, over meals. Two questions. What opportunities for growth and vitality do you see in your congregation in the face of the realities, the contours of our shifting world that Ray has laid out for us? And number two, what help do you need to meet those challenges? Because the answer to that question is the whole purpose for something like a bishop's office. I've said it before, I'll say it again. The only excuse for a bishop and everything it takes to run diocese is the support of local congregations, because it is the local congregation, I believe with everything I've got, that's the most reliable place of encounter with the risen Christ. Not the only place, not the only place, but a place of reliable encounter. And Lee Mitchell used to say, any Lee Mitchell students here? When he taught his liturgy classes prayer book, he used to say, maybe you've heard him say it, that when talking about prayer book revision, he said the Book of Common Prayer has to change in order to remain the same. I believe the same thing is true of the mission of the church. It has in every age. The other thing I'm grateful for the honesty in these is Charles Williams, the great spiritual writer, has said that the first rule of the spiritual life is accuracy. So to be clear about how daunting or how exhilarating or how whatever any of this makes us is important to admit and to say right out loud, because we're in the midst of tectonic plate shift changes over which we have no control. But the gospel remains entrusted to us, and sisters and brothers, the world over. So Ray, thank you for challenging us and for entertaining us. That's the best way to challenge us, and for your generosity. Thank you, thank you, thank you.